Hello and welcome everyone to a special edition of The Difference Makers at Difference Makers Media. I'm Lynn Sanders, your host, and we have a very special guest today. This is a guest who can help us in probably almost every aspect of our life when we're dealing with anger, whether it's anger at us or anger directed at others. That guest is Dr. David Gruder. Dr. Gruder is a 12 award-winning human potential peak performance psychologist and an internationally recognized expert in anger literacy. We're going to learn all about that today. David's mission is to make integrity profitable, leaders elevated, collaboration productive, happiness sustainable, and society healthy. And don't we need that? Yes. David is also the president of Integrity Culture Systems, among many other roles that he assumes. So without further ado, welcome, David, and thank you so much for coming today.
Well, thanks, Lynn. It's a pleasure to be with you on your show.
I'm really glad to have you. Tell us, how did you get into this whole field of anger literacy? What was your background?
Well, my background was actually growing up in a family where there were two versions of anger. One was from my father, who was a rageaholic. He was an exploder. And my mom was an imploder. She would express anger through doing things like slamming cabinet doors and things like that. And by the time I was in my mid-teens, as far as I knew back then, those two versions of anger were all of what anger was. And so the very, very explicit decision that I made back then, and I put it back into words in exactly this way back then, was I don't do anger.
Right.
Now, that's impossible. Nobody doesn't do anger because feelings are always buried alive. They're never buried dead. So what I did was I drove my anger underground by insisting that I don't do anger. And it really wasn't until I was in my 40s and was finally trained in a remarkable approach to anger literacy that I finally was able to reconnect with my anger and develop a healthy relationship with it. So, that in my 40s, that was, back in the 1600s. So no. It was over 20 years ago, about 25 years ago, that I was first exposed to the approaches to anger literacy that I have been doing my best among my other responsibilities to spread around the world, because they're so far, far superior to the prevailing approaches to dealing with anger, which are anger management or anger catharsis. The anger catharsis is where you're, taking a tennis racket to your mattress or something like that. I refer to it as the he or she who can pound the hardest and scream the loudest wins approach. And that actually makes anger worse in most cases. And anger management rather, is very, very limited in its usefulness.
Wow. Well, I don't think most people even understand all the different threads, the streams of anger, because what you just described between your mother and your father, to me, seems typical for most people. Get it out or keep it inside.
Yeah.
So tell us really, how does anger literacy work?
Well, it starts with understanding what anger really is.
Okay. What is anger really?
Funny you should ask. Anger, on one level, we could call anger life energy not available for living.
Wow.
And that was one of the definitions that I was exposed to when I got my training in anger literacy, which I'll go into in a little more detail in a little while. But the definition of true pure anger is simply no or ouch. That's it. All that anger is no or ouch.
Well, that seems very limiting. No or ouch.
That's all anger is. Anger is where we have when we find ourselves in a situation where something is going on that doesn't fit for us, and it either hurts or it's a boundary. It's about a no. This doesn't work for me. And when we ignore our no's or our ouches, they turn into what most people then refer to as anger.
I see. So could you break down what are the stages that you go through? You've developed a whole platform so people could understand how to manage anger. We talked about prevention and completion and effectiveness before. So tell us, how do we go through managing anger?
Well, yes,
or dealing with it?
Yeah, dealing with anger, because I don't want this to be confused with anger management, because it's so much more than that. Let me answer that question in a moment. I first want to tip my hat to the shoulders that I'm standing on with this material. So for about a 20-year period, from the 1970s to the 1990s, there was a study that was conducted at the University of Arizona at Tucson that came about because the teaching hospital at the University of Arizona at Tucson, their pain clinic, had run into a problem. And the problem was that of their pain patients, there were certain patients of theirs where the treatment seemed very clear. What the right treatment was seemed very clear to the medical team. And yet when they did that intervention medically, the pain rather didn't clear. The pain didn't go away. And there are certain forms of pain that are baffling to medical science. They don't know exactly how to identify the origins of certain types of pain. And with other origins, they're really pretty clear about the root causes or the physiological causes, and they're pretty clear about what the treatment is. So they finally had this light bulb moment, and they said, because of this segment of our pain patients that aren't responding to treatment that we're certain they should have responded to, maybe light bulb moment, maybe there's a psychological problem. So they go to the psych department at the University of Arizona, and the chair of the department back then is the late Roger Daldrip, and they go to Dr. Daldrip and they say to him, "Is there anything you can do for us?" And Roger had the perfect attitude about research. He said, "I don't know, let's find out." So instead of coming in with a theory about anger or pain or whatever it was, they just simply allowed the patients that weren't responding to the indicated treatment to teach them what was really going on. And what they found was that these patients who were non-responsive to the treatments that should have worked all had unresolved anger issues.
Wow.
So they started then to develop, through trial and error, a procedure for helping those patients complete their unresolved anger, not manage it, but complete it, put an end to the root causes of that anger. And lo and behold, when those particular patients completed that unresolved anger, the treatment that should have worked for dealing with their pain finally worked. So
wow.
Over this 20-year period, they turned this into a whole approach to dealing with anger that's technically called focused expressive psychotherapy. And the problem is that while these researchers and clinicians and academicians ended up developing what was the most well-researched approach to dealing with anger that my field of psychology has ever seen, not a single one of them was an entrepreneur. And as a result of that, as the developers of this method ended up retiring and then dying, the work has not gone on. And I happened to be blessed with being in a training group, which was the last training group that the head of this project, Roger Daldrip, who I mentioned earlier, was giving. And as far as I know, I'm the last living psychologist who has been fully certified to train other therapists as well as the public and certify them in this approach to dealing with anger.
Well, this is really important for everyone to know about. So you've got to get this message out and this information out, because we're all dealing with anger every day now. Just turn on the news, right? So,
Exactly.
so
Exactly.
are you, we're going to be able to today to give I think, just a little taste of
Yes.
how to deal with this and how we can develop a healthy relationship with anger. But I'm hoping at the end of this, you'll be able to let us know where we can get even more information.
Sure. Absolutely. So what this all led to was that I started facilitating anger completion workshops and doing the work individually with people as well. And over a number of years of doing that, I started to really see how the work that had been done at the University of Arizona could be taken into a broader framework that I refer to as full spectrum anger literacy and effectiveness. And I apologize, by the way, if you hear any background noise. I just noticed that a garbage truck showed
Oh,
up
no.
outside, and they're going to be loading in a dumpster in a moment. So,
That's okay. We're going to deal with it in a calm way, right, David?
well, we could get angry, but
Yeah,
why?
right. Yeah, exactly.
And so this whole framework that I call Conquering Anger Mountain is what emerged from doing literally thousands of these anger workouts, these procedures for completing unresolved anger in literally as little as 20 minutes.
Oh,
And
that's fantastic.
and that's what I want to share, because what all of that work revealed was that anger, to come back to the question you asked me a little while ago, anger comes in 4 distinctly different flavors, and each of these 4 varieties of anger needs to be dealt with differently from the other ones. So those 4 flavors of anger, the first one I mentioned briefly earlier in this interview. It's the form of anger that almost never gets called anger, even though it's the only form of anger that's actually true, pure anger, which is no or ouch. What is no or ouch? It's 1/2 of boundaries. Boundaries are about yes and yum and no and ouch. Yes and yum is about what fits for me. No and ouch is what doesn't fit for me.
That's
So
great.
pure anger is simply 1/2 of a boundary. It's the no and ouch part of a boundary. When we either don't know that we have a boundary, we don't know we have a no or an ouch, or we hope we can get away with ignoring it, what happens is that we then shift into the second form of anger, which is really the first variety of anger that people identify as anger, which is agitation. It's escalation, where we start feeling more and more and more agitated inside ourselves. We're getting more aggravated and annoyed and resentful and tight inside. That's escalating anger. That's anger where the intervention is simply doing a U-turn. The intervention is simply saying, "Oh, I'm getting agitated right now. I'm escalating with my anger because I must have a boundary that I either didn't know I had about this situation or this person, or that I hoped I could get away with ignoring." And so the intervention is very simple. Oh, I'm agitated, I'm escalating. I wonder what my boundary is. So we do a U-turn back into discovering our boundaries. When we ignore the agitation or escalation and we don't do a U-turn back to boundaries, what happens is that our agitation, the escalation, keeps rising and rising until we reach a tipping point, a breaking point, where we're so agitated that our body is kicking off, is manufacturing, releasing a lot of stress hormones, norepinephrine, adrenaline, cortisol, and those stress hormones go straight up into our brain.
Wow.
The function that those hormones have when they go into our brain is they turn off the thinking part of our brain, and they turn on our animal brain, our reptile brain, our limbic system. And when we are limbic system activated and the thinking part of our brain is turned off, we cannot think our way out of a paper bag. Anger management can't work because Anger management requires being able to think, and the thinking
Yes.
part of our brain is turned off when we're flooded. This is called flooded
Yes.
anger because our brain has been flooded literally with these stress chemicals. And when our brain is flooded with these stress chemicals, our repertoire, our way of responding is limited to 4 interventions, 4 ways of responding: fight, flight, freeze, or faint. So fight is we put up our dukes and we
Exactly.
do our explosive anger stuff. Flee is where we run. We try to avoid.
Exactly.
Freeze is like the deer in the headlights. We just get so overwhelmed that we just literally freeze. We don't know what to do. We get speechless. And faint is where we play possum. We just play dead. We go silent and we hope that the threat will pass, and that we'll be okay by playing dead. That's it.
Fascinating.
That's our whole repertoire when we're in flooded anger is fight, flight, freeze, or faint, and none of those things really deal with the anger. They're purely self-protective mechanisms. So we have boundaries, which is never called anger, but it's pure anger. We have escalation, which is that increasing amount of agitation. That's simply nothing more than an invitation for us to discover or take ownership of our boundaries. And we have flooded anger, which is where our brain is so bathed in stress chemicals that we can't do that U-turn anymore, at least until our body has reabsorbed those stress chemicals in our thinking part of our brain. Our cortex comes back online. And then there's the fourth form, the fourth flavor of these 4 forms of anger. And that fourth flavor is recycling anger, looping anger. It's the anger that feeds on itself, that an ego in search of evidence always finds it. So when we have unresolved anger from prior situations, either with a particular person that's in a current situation with us or with some other person or incident that has nothing to do with the current situation, but where we still have unresolved anger from that prior situation, we can go from 0 to light speed with our anger in a split second.
Amazing.
And that's looping, recycling anger, where this situation is just like blah, blah, blah that happened in the past, and where the only, what we're telling ourselves is that the only way that we can be okay is if another person or a circumstance is different from what it is. So what looping or recycling anger is a very blustery form of self-victimization, where we're insisting that something that isn't going to change has to change before we can be whole and complete. And that form of anger requires anger completion. It requires identifying where that anger originally developed and never got resolved, and bringing that original anger circumstance to a state of completion where we've harvested gifts from it and we're no longer harmed in the present by something unacceptable, usually, that occurred in our past.
Wow. So we really have to be able to step away from anger in order to really move forward. Because it seems, it's starting from the boundaries, because it sounds like each level you're getting more and more out of control, would you say? Each of these, from the agitation to the flooding to recycling, which is someone's hitting that pressure point that is your weak spot and you're going to explode because that's the spot.
Yeah,
so,
these are increasingly dysfunctional forms of anger.
Which is what we see all the time around us.
Exactly. And so why wouldn't we, if all we know is anger, is escalation, flooding, and recycling anger, why wouldn't we say, I don't want to have anything to do with anger? Of course, that's what we might want to say. But that's only because we don't know what true anger is.
So tell us, what is true anger, and how do we come to terms with it and have a healthy relationship with anger? Is that fair enough to ask?
Sure. So I've already said what true anger is. It's no or ouch. It's half of the boundary. And how we come into good relationship with anger is through learning how to recognize which flavor of anger we happen to be in a given moment, and having the skills pre-built inside us through training that enable us to be literate, capable of intervening with ourselves or someone else in the way that is right matched for what works with that flavor of anger. So it's about expanding our repertoire of being able to recognize and respond to these 4 different flavors of anger.
So can you give us some examples of how we can expand our repertoire? What can we do if we're in the midst? I had a situation yesterday, and I realized it was just in a phone conversation with a family member, and it was starting to escalate out of the blue. And so I just realized whatever I was saying was not being heard. It was just getting louder and louder on the other side. And I had to withdraw and just say nothing. And finally, this person didn't want to address it anymore. And I said, fine, I think that's a good idea. I'd like to get your insights. And for everyone here, how do we find a way to get out of these cycles?
Okay.
Going beyond a no and ouch.
Great example. So let's do the answer in 2 parts. Part 1, if things haven't escalated to the point where you or the other person are flooded, we'll deal with flooding second. So if flooding is in operation, we'll deal with that in a moment. But first version is if what's going on is this increasing escalation, but we haven't flooded yet, right. Then what the intervention is to say to ourselves and to the other person, well, wait a second. It's funny. Can you hear emergency?
We're escalating in the noise.
We've got an anger emergency. This is perfect timing for the sound effects with what I'm talking about. That's the alert saying that what we need to do when we're escalating is say to each other, well, wait a second, we're getting more and more agitated here, and I care about you, and I care about finding a solution to this thing that we're talking about. Let's just take a breath and do a U-turn and come back to identifying what our core intentions are. What are we really trying to accomplish? What's the noble thing that we're each trying to accomplish through discussing this thing that we're discussing?
Makes sense.
So that's what we're capable of doing when we're escalating, but haven't escalated to the point where our brain is flooded with these stress chemicals, where we're still able to think. We're capable of doing a U-turn, right? So that's part 1 of the answer. Part 2 is that oftentimes people won't realize that the conversation has gone to HE double hockey sticks in a basket until after they've flooded, where their brains of, their thinking part of their brain is turned off. They're in their reptile brain. And in that case, the only intervention that's possible until the brain that's flooded with brain chemicals those chemicals have receded from the brain and the thinking part of the brain is turned back on again, which takes an average of 15 to 20 minutes, is to take a time out, is to say, look, we've gotten I have gotten so agitated in this conversation, I can't even think straight again. So the next words that would come out of my mouth right now are going to be toxic and poisonous. I'm not going there. I'm taking a time out in order to recenter myself so I can continue a conversation with you in a useful way.
Wow, that is so true. Take a break.
That's a timeout. Timeout is the intervention of choice when escalation has gotten to the point of flooding, where the form of anger has become flooded anger. You just take a time out. You don't try to think it through. You don't try to keep talking about it right then. You give your brains the 15 to 20 minutes that they need in order for the stress chemicals to recede from our brains so the thinking part of our brain comes back on. And then you either try to resume the conversation or you resume a conversation inside yourself to discover where you got derailed, what your boundaries really are, so that you can then, after that, go back to the other person and continue the conversation in a much clearer, more useful way.
Right. I really like the fact that you're tying the inner thoughts with the physical chemistry that's going on in our body. I don't know if people even recognize that, because if we're caught in the moment of the anger, we don't realize what it's doing to our body. And as you said, making us going into our reptilian brain so that we physically cannot think clearly.
Absolutely. And each one of these skill sets for each one of these forms of anger, they're totally learnable. That's the thing. That's why I created the course that I created, because these are simply life skills. They're learnable. They aren't psychotherapy. They're psychoeducation.
So tell us about your course, unless you want to finish with the last. We were also talking about recycling anger. Is there a different way to deal with that than what you've already said?
Oh, yes. Yes,
Okay,
absolutely.
let's finish that one then.
That's about anger completion. That's about recognizing that we're in a loop where our anger is just looping on itself, and that what we do is we essentially go on an inner journey to identify where the source is of the incident that occurred sometime in our past, which could be anywhere from yesterday or even earlier today, all the way back as far back as we go. It could be at any point in time, but some incident where we were dealing with a situation where we didn't honor our own boundaries. We didn't know how to recognize or honor those boundaries. We might have been too young in certain situations to be able to take care of our own boundaries ourselves, and where we are, because of that, carrying unresolved anger from a prior unexpected situation, undesired situation, or even unacceptable life situation, and where we were expecting and requiring the situation to be different before we could be okay, or one or more other people to be different before we could be okay. And so the recycling or looping anger is fueled by this victimization mentality. Even though it's really loud and blustery and self-righteous and all of that stuff, it doesn't look like disempowerment. It's huge disempowerment, because we're basically saying, I can't be whole and complete until a situation is different from what it is, or a person is behaving in some way that's different from how they're behaving. And when we have that attitude, we're basically saying other people and situations are the boss of us, are the boss of our internal state of well-being. And then we're having the audacity on top of that to say, to take a stance that says, those past situations are going to continue to have that control over me in the present until something outside of me changes, and I'm right about how wrong they are, and I'm right to be angry about what's going on. Now, let me just do one quick side piece around this, because a lot of recycling or looping anger for people who are passionate about social issues has to do with social injustice, social justice issues where an injustice is happening. And I want to make it really clear that what I'm not talking about is doing inner work in order to allow unacceptable behaviors to continue. That's not okay. Social justice issues, or if it's not a social issue, an injustice in a personal relationship, those behaviors and words need to change. They do need to change. The problem is that if I'm waiting for a situation or a person to change before I can be okay, nothing's going to change. The only way that I can move forward in an effective way is to restore my own well-being. Because if I'm responding to an unacceptable situation from a state of internal well-being and centeredness, my empowerment is light years better than if I'm trying to react to that unacceptable situation in an agitated, amped up way myself. So It's really important that our listeners understand, I'm not saying, when I'm talking about resolving, recycling anger or anger related to injustice, I'm not saying, oh yeah, let injustice continue. Injustice needs to be contained. I'm saying, take responsibility for your own internal state so that you can deal with those injustices in a truly empowered way rather than in a victim way.
Exactly. I understand what you're saying. You're saying we choose, this is something that my good friend Roland used to talk about. We choose our emotions in life. So we can choose to respond rather than react. Correct? That's
We
what you're
can
saying.
choose to develop the skills that are necessary in order for us to respond rather than react. It's not just like, I'm going to snap my fingers and choose this. If that could have worked, it would have worked a long time ago. It's not that simple, but it is simple enough to be learnable as a skill set. Epictetus said what you just put into words beautifully as a soundbite 2,000 years ago, ancient Greek philosopher. He said, people are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of them.
Hmm.
That says it all. And so this is an issue of self-responsibility. If I'm disturbed not by things, but by the views I take of them, then my self-responsibility calls upon me to do whatever I need to do in order to modify my views so that I'm not disturbed by things, but I am empowered to intervene with things that are going on that aren't good, that really need to be intervened with.
Now, I would say that this would take a bit of time and your inner journey, because I've dealt with different situations myself. So I would think most people could use some help along the way. Would you agree? I mean, this is to be able to really understand the pain points and how to get out of this cycle that keeps reoccurring. What do you recommend people do to step out of this?
Right. Well, at the risk of sounding self-serving, I recommend that they enroll in my full spectrum anger literacy and effectiveness course, because that's what's going to give them the skills that they've never been exposed to probably for taking charge of their own internal state around anger issues and around boundaries and around healthy personal power, so that all that they then have to do from there is to practice the step by step procedures that I've mapped out in the course for dealing with each of these 4 different flavors of anger and for repairing damage that has inadvertently been done when we haven't dealt with our anger before our anger has created damage with others or other people's anger has created damage with us. So there's also a repair module in the course for dealing with that.
Wow, I'm glad you brought that up because I did want to talk a little bit more detail. We have a few more minutes left. At least I would like to just touch on what are some of the important things, if you could just draw out a few highlights from your course that will help people on their journey to anger literacy.
Right. So point number 1, anger is not one monolithic thing. Anger comes in 4 distinctly different varieties, and each one has to be dealt with differently from the other 3. Point number 2 is that what true, pure anger is rarely called anger. It's rarely identified as anger, even though it's pure, true anger. It's that one half of boundaries, the half of boundaries having to do with what doesn't fit for us, the no, the ouch. The third is that the skills for dealing with all 4 of these flavors of anger, boundaries, escalation, flooding, and recycling or looping anger, are learnable skills. And they can be learned in a very specific, step-by-step way, not in some kind of way where, somebody says, well, here's the mindset you should have. Now figure out how to access that mindset. These are step-by-step skills for dealing with each one of these 4 different flavors of anger. And then from there, it's simply a matter of practicing the skills. Anybody can practice skills.
This is excellent. And I know that you give talks all over the world. So I want to toot your horn a bit to say that even even if you're one person you're working in a company, these are skills that would apply. I would definitely say for your company, and I would recommend learning more from David, either through his course or even talking to him personally. I have a short link that we can all take a look at where you can get a special price. I believe it's a wonderful course. If you go to the short link is bit.b as in boy, it.ly/anger with a capital A, lowercase N-G-E-R, and then mountain, capital M, lowercase, rest of the word. So it's bit.ly/anger mountain with a capital A and M. And then that's where you're going to find David's course. David, can you tell us a little bit about what you can offer people who want to get personal help from you beyond the video course? Where can they find you, your website, and what can you talk to them about?
Sure. I just want to emphasize first that the capitalization in the bit.ly link is very important, the capital A and the capital M in Anger Mountain, because if they don't capitalize the A and the M, they're not going to get to the course. Exactly. So two parts to answering your question. One part specifically having to do with anger. Yes, it's true. I've been brought into businesses to help personnel elevate their anger literacy and to help resolve conflicts that have happened because people didn't know how to deal with anger effectively. I'm a culture architect. I help elevate the health of cultures and businesses and nonprofits and agencies and things like that, and with leaders. The second is I have given keynotes and training programs around the world on many, many topics, including anger literacy. I've given training programs for therapists on anger literacy in the United States, Canada, Mexico, England, so in multiple countries. And my main website is drgruder.com. It's drgruder.com. And on that website, you can get a feel for the full range of keynotes, training programs, both in person and online, and mentoring that I provide to leaders, entrepreneurs, businesses, nonprofits, etc. So that's how to learn more about the direct services that I offer.
Great, thank you, because I didn't want anyone listening to this thinking that you just have a course. David has a wide breadth and depth of information and skills that he can help all of us with, and I'm really excited to learn more myself. Before we go, I wanted you to give us one last parting thought, David. If you could think of one message you want people to remember, what would that be? Good closing.
This is wonderful. So it's my favorite humorous comment to make about anger. I'm going to pull a Mr. Rogers on you. Hopefully all of our listeners know who Mr. Rogers is or was.
Yes.
Anger is your friend. And what I mean by that is that anger is nothing to be afraid of, the way that I was growing up in my family with those two dysfunctional forms of anger that I mistakenly thought were all that anger was about. Anger is our internal communication mechanism that's alerting us that we have a boundary that we haven't recognized that we had, or we underestimated the importance of honoring, of addressing. So if we can stop being afraid of our anger and other people's anger, if we can stop indulging our own anger or letting other people indulge their anger, and instead develop this inquisitive attitude around anger when it comes up in us or other people, that is an inquiry around, gee, I wonder what's not fitting for me or for this other person. I wonder what's underneath the anger, rather than getting in an arm wrestling match about the anger itself. Everything shifts when we do that. And that's what I mean by saying anger is your friend.
I love that. Anger is your friend. Parting words, remember. Learn from anger, make it your friend, and your life will probably be transformed in the process. Would you agree?
Yes, I do indeed, and that's what anger literacy is all about.
Terrific. Thank you so much, David. On that closing note, I want to thank everyone here for listening. Feel free to share this with your friends and colleagues. Feel free to go to David directly at drgruder.com or check out his course at bit.ly/Anger Mountain with a capital A, capital M. And until next time, have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.